Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. If you've spent even 5 minutes scrolling through social media lately, or, survived a tense Thanksgiving dinner, you've definitely heard the term culture war. It's everywhere. And usually it's framed as this incredibly simple battle between good and evil, right? Depending entirely on who you ask, of course. But if we take a step back and look objectively at the underlying research and data, we find something far more intricate, dynamic, and honestly, a lot more fascinating.
So let's dive right into this by asking a pretty heavy question. Is America truly in a binary civil war? Or is that just a really popular narrative that's masking a much deeper reality? You see media headlines and political speeches constantly suggesting that Americans are taking sides in this apocalyptic battle for the nation's soul. But to really grasp what's happening right now, we have to look past the fiery rhetoric and examine the actual philosophical and social frameworks that are driving these divisions.
We often hear this described as a culture war, which researchers define as a fundamental clash over moral authority. The popular assumption is that there are literally two distinct armies fighting it out. But as you'll see, it's way more than a simple two-sided conflict. It's actually this complex web spanning politics, religion, gender identity, economics, and differing views on personal freedom.
Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We're going to look at 1. The myth of the binary war. 2. Political and economic factions. 3. The religious and moral front. 4. Gender and identity. And 5. How this all ties together into a web of competing visions.
All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the myth of the binary war, and what the data actually says about it.
Now, there's this concept called the distribution hypothesis. Basically, it assumes total, perfect polarization. It's the idea that if you know a person's stance on just one single issue, you automatically know their stance on literally everything else. It paints us as irreconcilably divided into two entirely opposed camps. But when sociologists actually put this to the test using massive datasets, the results completely blew that theory out of the water.
The data suggests that, completely contrary to popular belief, most Americans actually cluster right toward the center. It's kind of wild. The World Values Survey shows people share a ton of social attitudes and religious beliefs. In fact, on a lot of social issues, attitudes are actually converging over time. Now, abortion is one of the very few true exceptions here, where opinions remain sharply and consistently polarized, but overall, we are way more centrist than we think.
Which brings us to Section 2, political and economic factions. We're going to break down these competing visions of government and liberty.
Let's start on the right. Conservatism generally views rapid cultural change as a direct threat to societal stability and individual freedom. Its core philosophy is all about preserving traditional social structures, religious heritage, and constitutional originalism. Historically, this is deeply tied to something called fusionism, which was an alliance that combined the desire for free market capitalism with traditional, religiously based social values.
But what are the blind spots here? Well, critics often highlight ideological contradictions. For example, championing small government while simultaneously advocating for state intervention to restrict things like reproductive rights or public school curricula. Observers also point out a heavy nostalgia that can totally ignore historical inequities, like racial or gender discrimination. Plus, there's a frequent reliance on populist grievance politics and moral panics to mobilize voters, rather than focusing on actual policy outcomes.
Flipping over to the other side of the spectrum, we have liberals and democratic socialists. Now, liberals generally focus on institutional reform, civil rights protections, and using democratic institutions to regulate markets. Democratic socialists, on the other hand, argue that cultural issues are actually deeply tied to economic inequality. They push for universal public goods like healthcare and housing, and actively seek to break up corporate wealth and power.
But just like the right, critics point out some massive blind spots on the left. For liberals, it's often performative activism, prioritizing symbolic gestures over structural change and trying to appease corporate donors, which results in watered-down policies. They also tend to have a huge overtrust in legacy institutions. For democratic socialists, critics highlight a rigid ideological purity, where compromise is seen as a sellout. There's also a lot of economic idealism that ignores fiscal realities, and of course, the famous Hayekian critique, the idea that shifting democratic majorities just can't sustain long-term central economic planning. All right, moving on to Section 3, the religious and moral front. This asks the fundamental question, where does moral authority actually reside?
At the absolute deepest level, this is a huge philosophical divide. Moral absolutists locate moral authority entirely outside the self, in a transcendental sphere, like God, or universal, unbreakable rules. Moral relativists, however, locate authority within the mundane sphere,
meaning the individual self, or the specific situation you're in, is the final judge of what is right and wrong.
When we apply this framework to religious conservatives and traditionalists, their core philosophy is that morality is objective and divine. They emphasize faith, community, the sanctity of life, and traditional family structures. But critics highlight a major flaw here: the danger of imposing specific religious dogma onto a pluralistic, secular society. Observers also point out some selectivity and hypocrisy, where strict adherence to sexual ethics often overlooks socioeconomic justice or completely excuses the character flaws of political leaders who happen to promise them power.
There's this fantastic quote from the source material that really anchors the traditionalist worldview perfectly. It shows just how deeply right-wing political theology relies on an unchangeable moral imperative. For the traditionalist, these aren't just cultural preferences. They are absolute truths rooted in the very nature of existence itself.
Next up is Section 4, Gender, Identity, and Social Issues. This is truly the modern digital battleground.
Researchers are tracking a severe crisis of connection and social isolation among young men right now. Feeling like societal expectations are totally unclear, many are turning to the internet for guidance. This has fueled the rapid rise of the manosphere, which is this vast digital space ranging from fathers' rights advocates to traditionalists, all trying to define what a good man is in a rapidly changing world.
Now, while their core philosophy often starts by addressing genuine male social isolation, critics heavily document its severe flaws. These spaces can so easily slide into a reactionary grievance culture that just blames women for structural discontent. Plus, algorithmic amplification pushes a lot of well-meaning users toward extreme misogyny while enforcing these incredibly rigid standards of masculinity that actually discourage vulnerability and harm men's emotional health.
Conversely, feminist and LGBTQ+ movements are fighting to liberate individuals from those exact restrictive traditional structures. Their core philosophy centers heavily on self-determination, bodily autonomy, protection from discrimination, equal pay, and validating diverse gender identities while dismantling patriarchal standards.
But again, looking objectively at the critiques, there are distinct blind spots here too. There are deep internal fractures, like debates over trans inclusion. There are massive class and race blind spots, like how mainstream corporate lean-in feminism often caters strictly to affluent women while totally leaving lower-income women behind. Researchers also point to linguistic hyperpolicing, where rapidly changing terminology carries high social penalties that alienate well-meaning allies, as well as pushing rapid changes in schools that critics view as institutional overreach.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, A Web of Competing Visions and the Future of the Imagined Community.
Here's the thing that makes this entire conflict so incredibly intense. America is what sociologists call an imagined community. It isn't bound together by a single ancient ancestry or thousands of years of shared history. It's bound by a shared ideology, a sort of civil religion. Because these ideas are literally the only glue holding the nation together, a fundamental crisis of values poses a direct, existential threat to the country's social integration.
Seymour Martin Lipset hit the nail on the head when he said, "Being an American is an ideological commitment." This summarizes exactly why these competing visions, whether they're economic, moral, or gender-based, feel like life or death to the people fighting for them. To lose the ideological battle feels to many like losing the very definition of what it means to be an American in your own home.
So I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. If our shared ideology is the primary thing holding us together, how do we navigate and actually coexist within this incredibly complex web of competing visions? How does an imagined community survive that? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. See you next time.